Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the redneck. You bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to get you to do it too. And as a reminder, as we do every week here on Redneck Gone Green, when we talk about going green, we don't mean mere environmentalism. We're talking about something different and deeper. We're talking about ecology, the interconnectedness of all things. And whether you come at that from a hard science perspective or you come at it from a deeply eco-feminist spiritual perspective, or like me, you say both of those things are true, I'm going to tell you this. We are all connected in this web of life, and whatever we as humans do to that web, we are ultimately doing to ourselves. And let's be real, y'all, we doing it wrong. We are literally destroying Mother Earth faster than she can replenish herself. And here on Redneck Gone Green, we don't just describe the problem. Y'all, there are plenty of Ain't It Awful podcasts and web series out there doing a good job of how bad it is. But here on Redneck Gone Green, we try to bring you voices of people who are doing something about it. And on the program today, we're going to bring you Christian Ortiz, somebody who is in fact doing something about it. Christian is a multifaceted American out of Denver, Colorado. He's a filmmaker, a musician, a photographer, an artist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. He's been bridging the idea of creativity and business for years, and he specializes in helping creatives build sustainable business while empowering companies to create meaningful, impactful both brands and products. He calls himself a decolonial technologist, and he has created the world's first artificial intelligence from a specifically intentional decolonial lens. He also first came to my attention for a powerful essay that he wrote called You Weren't Born White, You Were Made White. It is my pleasure to bring y'all Christian Ortiz. Christian, welcome to Redneck Gone Green.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure being here.
Well, thank you so much. Well, look at here. I am really excited about this program, and I come into it skeptical AF, as the kids say. So I'm going to be for real with you, Christian. That's where we're going to go. But before we do, I want to give you a chance to share with the audience just who are you, right? Like, where I'm from, like, who are you? Who are your people? Where you come from really matters. So I'm going to ask you to just take a moment to back up. Tell us where you grew up, who are your people, what shaped your political worldview.
Absolutely. I was born in Los Angeles, California in the 80s from a single mother household. My mom is from Puerto Rico. My dad is from Mexico. They separated pretty early on in my existence. And then we left Los Angeles during the LA riots to New Jersey. And I spent quite some time there in New Jersey and New York. Growing up around my Puerto Rican family and detached from my Mexican side of my family. So very early, I got to experience being othered in my own family, meaning I was treated differently because I looked indigenous. I was darker than the others, my two older brothers. And I was always called a Mexicano right from the start, right? And so I didn't understand a lot of what was happening in my upbringing regarding the complexities of my culture and my identity. And those are things that we didn't really talk about growing up. And then I spent 25 years down in the South, in an hour and a half south of Atlanta, Georgia, in Columbus. So I had my racial awakening in terms of running right into racism for the first time in my life when I was very young, around 11, 12 years old in middle school. And lived in Georgia for 25 years. And so as a neurodivergent person who discovered he was neurodivergent in his 30s, my life kind of made sense of the direction of my decisions and the path that I took into activism, and really sat with what really matters the most and what mattered the most for me in my life, in my past, and my experiences. And because I was a social justice activist and an entrepreneur for most of my adult life, I decided to take it upon myself to see what I can do to really bring some real change into the world and bring a perspective into the conversations about race that we really have never had.
Was there a particular individual moment where you became conscious of the systems where both race and class and colonization all came together? Was it an ongoing process for you?
It was, yeah. So I attended college in Columbus, Georgia, Columbus State University. Columbus College is what it was called at the time. And my history teacher, I had a Mr. Johnson. He was kind of a younger white gentleman who had studied CRT since before it even had a label. And he was very big into decolonial studies, meaning studying what the world looked like before colonization. And so his history course was kind of my awakening into understanding that there was much more about the system that we didn't recognize. And he introduced me to understanding racism not as identity, but as a system in which keeps these social fabricated identities alive. And when I was able to understand that racism is a system, and it's the system of colonial white supremacy, then I was able to deep dive and go further, and then go down that rabbit hole of reading authors, W.E.B., and so many others along the years. And so I really became dedicated to decolonization in the early 2000s, I would say.
Both about colonization and also empire, because I think it's important that we really understand, like, empires suck. There's no doubt about it. But colonization is a particular horrific version of it, because if it's focused on permanent settlement and complete displacement and subjugation of indigenous populations. So this leads to a different, more profound, long-lasting impact. So empires conquer and exploit, yes, but colonization involves the deliberate dismantling of existing social systems and structures to establish a completely new order controlled by the colonizer. So I really appreciate how you have distinguished the system of colonization and also centered white supremacy around it. Because to me, as somebody with the pigment that I have, I don't know how we can get to the world that I want to live in, the one that's just, that's fair, that like lifts up all human beings and recognize the universality of it all, without actually confronting a horrific system that was created and is still in place. So, I want to thank you for the courage and the clarity about like who you are and where you come from. But I do want to get into this thing called artificial intelligence, because that's also a framework. It's also a system. And I'm going to tell you straight up, Christian, I'm skeptical. Like, this does not look good to me. So you're going to have to sell me, and I suspect many of the listeners and viewers are here on Redneck Gone Green about this new thing and this new framework. So let's get right into Justice AI and break down the core concepts for working class kids like me. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what is Justice AI, and how is it different from conventional artificial intelligence?
Absolutely, and it's a great question. Justice AI is simply it's an extension to ChatGPT. So anybody who has a ChatGPT subscription, which is about 2.2 million users a day, I know a lot of people are using ChatGPT, and more people are figuring it out. Justice AI is an extension that I built. It's a framework within itself. It is just what I called my extension of my GPT. I built it within OpenAI's ChatGPT, its framework, because they not only have the largest data set, they have the most biased data set. And so the goal for me was to create a GPT framework that could decolonize and deconstruct the bias in real time to solve for the AI bias problem. So ultimately, what I tell users and people who are just learning about this right now is that we've had this conversation about bias within AI. And we understand that bias comes from the training data that we feed into it. So if we understand the large language models like ChatGPT pull information from all over the internet, and we understand that all of that information is really Western centric, meaning built from the European white gaze per se that we have here in the United States and in North America and all over Europe, then we understand that there is an entire perspective that's being left out of this data and training data. So what I did is I collaborated with over 560 decolonial experts from around the world, and they each contributed over 30 years of their knowledge and expertise within DEI frameworks in their fields of work. And we collectively came together to put together the largest decolonial data set, and that is what runs Justice AI. And so I had to build an entire framework that I call the Decolonial Intelligence Algorithmic Framework.
So hold on, Christian. For people like me who's a little bit slow.
No,
right?
no worries.
I want to make sure, because I think I just had an insight here.
Yes,
so
sir.
The reason that artificial intelligence is so profoundly biased and sexist is because it's just drawing subsets from all of the data and making algorithms. So if it is true that we live in a racist and sexist society, which we do, then
Yes, sir.
artificial intelligence and the Chat GPT and all of these models are just replicating and spitting out the same sort of thing that we're living in. So am I getting that right?
100% right. 100% right. So what I always say, ultimately, to wrap it all up, is that when we talk about what bias actually is, social bias in a racial caste system, which, newsflash, if you were born anytime after the 1600s anywhere around the world, you are the byproduct of colonial white supremacy. And so it doesn't matter what your ethnicities are, what your race is, we all internalize it because we inherited this system that none of us asked for. And so so you're absolutely correct that all of the data is trained on Eurocentric colonial white supremacy. So bias, in definition, is the system of white supremacy through colonialism.
So this is really important too, because one of the things I appreciated, again, Christian, you first came to my attention because of that essay, You Weren't Born White, You Were Made White. And we are going to get into that. But what I really especially appreciated about your essay is it was one of the sharpest, clearest, most precise writings that I had seen on whiteness without being cutting, right? Like there is a lot of the decolonial or white supremacist critique that feels very anti my pigment. And when I read yours, I actually felt a level of compassion and if I could say without being ridiculous, almost sadness about how white supremacy actually hurts people who look like me. So I'm going to invite you to say, David, you reading too much into it, or like I want to be real. I want to be transparent and vulnerable with you. When I read that essay, I thought this fella is onto something.
I really greatly appreciate it. No, and you're right on the money with it. What I started realizing along the way of doing this work, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago specifically, is I started having conversations during Trump's first administration with people who I grew up with, friends that I made for 20 plus years, who I was left with this option to say, either I really need to understand where they're coming from, where they're missing the mark, where they're not getting the full picture, or I'm just going to have to end friendships time and time and time again. And sometimes we have to, because we have to protect our peace, and we have to understand that we really have no power to convince anybody of anything. I'm a firm believer of that. But I do believe that I can inspire people to see a bigger picture. And so while I was having these conversations with my Southern folk in the South that I've known for 20 plus years, I started understanding that for the first time, it clicked for me that white people have racial trauma too. Race is a social construct. I have to just make that point blank clear. It was created by colonialism. Race didn't exist before the 1600s. It was perfected in the 1600s by our European colonizers. But we have never really taken the time to say, you know what, white people have racial trauma as well. It doesn't look anything like what we carry as black and brown and visible minorities or people of the global majority, but they absolutely have trauma from what they carry generationally through colonialism. So my job then was to dedicate myself to figure out what happened. What happened to white people and what's happening right now. I'm also a decolonial social scientist, so I have to study and identify how the inner mind works for people who live with the intersections of multiple realities of identity. And so when we take a step back and we're able to understand racism is a social construct, but racism is also a system that keeps that social construct alive. And we have to understand what that system has done to even white people. And that's where my article takes a deep dive to help people understand. You had culture before you were given this identity of whiteness, and it was stripped away from you through colonialism. And you are actually grieving what has been lost. And as a up and coming elder in community, we use this term that collectively we are going through a remembrance. We are remembering something that is very spiritual and cultural and deeply rooted in really our understanding of what used to be within our societies. And so it helps us take a deep breath to say, it's not my job to point the finger at you for being white, or for me for being Latino, or for them for being black, or for them to being Asian. It's a matter about understanding how this system of white supremacy has literally stripped everything that we've ever known about ourselves and have given us this false identity.
Boy, you said it. You said it. Where I'm from, Christian would say you said a mouthful there. So I'm gonna back us up a little bit because it was profound, important, and I want to really unpack that a little bit. First
Yes.
and foremost, I appreciate the clarity that race is a construct and racism is deadly, real, and serious. In other words, y'all, like when Christian, or I'll just speak for myself, right? When I talk about race as a construct, that means in biology, race does not exist, right?
Correct.
Melanin exists, but race does not exist. It was socially created, uh, but that doesn't mean it's not real. Looky here, like money is a social construct. Try to get through this capitalist society without it, right? Like, so the impacts that it has in the real world are profound. But the idea of whiteness being created, I think, is really important because it was, as you say, Christian, created during the 1600s on this continent, on Turtle Island. And why? Because it wasn't just Nat Turner. There were thousands of folks who were rising up against their enslavement, against their oppression. And what was really interesting is a lot of people of my pigmentation were actually working with them. Why? Because they were indentured servants who were also had the boot on their neck. And what the predatory class who had my pigment saw was, oh, they more of them than there are of us, and we can separate, we can divide and conquer. So they took people with my pigment and raised us up just a little bit and put them, quote, over those with darker pigment, right? Now, they did not rise those people all the way up to the level of the predatory ruling class, right? But just enough to be able to pit us against one another, right? It was a very intentional and deliberate maneuver to divide based on an artificial construct, right? And yes, there is absolutely privilege associated with that, but it comes at a heavy and profound cost. It comes at the cost of ethnic identity and history. It comes at the cost of culture. And that, my friends, for people who look like me, that privilege that you got, it's a bad deal. And that's the thing I think that people with my pigment are the most confused about race in this country.
I couldn't agree more. And you said it so perfectly. I always say, to your last point, colonialism gave white people this identity for access, but it stole their roots. You hear a lot of white people, especially in the States, in the United States, who say, well, the my ancestors were enslaved too with the Irish, and my great granddaddy was an Italian, and they suffered through racism as well. But what never happens is the follow up of that argument, which is, well, why is it that your ancestors faced racism for being white then, but then don't suffer the same racism today? And so there's this disconnect of information that happens, and this lack of education that's intentionally not given to our white brothers and sisters to help them understand that Italians and the Irish were given access to whiteness in the system so that there would be more of white individuals.
Oh, Christian, it's I love that you're bringing that up too, because in your essay you point to a book that changed my, like, it just rocked me, right? It completely gave me a new framework. It's called How the Irish Became White. And as a descendant of Irish folks, both Scots on one side and Irish on the other, like, that's the thing, right? The because of how the pigment works,
Yes.
Irish, Scots, who were and Italians and many others were able to get the wages of whiteness. They were allowed to become white. They didn't start that way, but
That's
they
right.
could become that. And that's
That's
a very powerful and very insidious, and I would argue particularly nefarious and evil thing that the predatory class did to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is an insidious genius behind this entire system that we've inherited when you really take a look at what we've inherited, what we are not taught, and how we are conditioned. And so that article in which we're speaking of right now that you're referencing is part of a series that I have, which is the ultimate guide of whiteness. And it helps people understand, especially my white brothers and sisters. The goal is to understand how the more you learn about this social construct, this false identity that was given to you, you get to see whiteness more as branding than actual identity or actual race. It is whiteness is a brand in Europe and in North America, and we mistake that branding for culture. And so when we really have this conversation to understand what culture actually is, then we get to understand that there really is no culture within the construct of whiteness. And so I encourage my friends then to dive deeper to figure out, who were your ancestors? Take an ancestry test and do some research into what were their practices, what were their traditions, where were the places that they actually came from, and what would that have looked like. And so it just opens up a very interesting rabbit hole, but it is such a wonderful conversation to have, because ultimately, I'll tell you this, David, my goal is to help people understand that a lot, if not most, of the social issues that we have outside of racism, depression, anxiety, keeping up with the Joneses. If you think about how a lot of white men struggle in corporate America and what they suffer from, and you look at the suicide rates, you can actually tie it all into rooted. It really comes down to the byproduct of the white supremacy that they have to survive, and this image that they have to constantly live through, to say, I'm not making you hear it all the time, I'm not making six figures, I don't have the car that I want, I have a terrible marriage, so and so has more money than me, I need better clothes, I need the top notch car of the year. All of these things are what we adopt in the system of white supremacy as white people. And I'm not speaking for myself clearly, but for most white men in positions of power. And so what happens is, when they don't meet these criteria, they start suffering more and more, and it actually impacts their health in ways that nobody talks about. And this is the reason why I'm pleading with all of my white audience to really understand that the system of white supremacy doesn't serve anyone unless you're elite.
You know, it reminds me, the first time as a cisgendered male, the first time I read Bell Hooks, and that first sentence, patriarchy harms men. Like that's the first line, and it went ding. I want to bring up a comment. You're getting a lot of love in the comments, but one that I think is really important is Michael Nugent writes in to say, part of what shaped my identity is being mixed race and being challenged about my own blackness. I was young and saw great disparity in wealth among racial lines. I started to hate oppression at a very young age. Christian, I'm wondering if you could speak to that little gem.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, it's you asked me in the very beginning of this how I even came about doing this work, and I honestly believe that my lived experience was the very foundation of the work that I do. I grew up not only as a mixed identity. My grandmother was African, who was born on an island without a name, and was taken to Puerto Rico during late stage slavery that nobody talks about. She married her husband, who was my grandfather, who was from Spain, who had roots in Puerto Rico and had very deep roots in Puerto Rico. So I have Taino blood in me from him, but his ancestry came from Spain. So I grew up with family members making racist comments, family members treating me differently, understanding how we operated as a society altogether with discrimination. And it just never made sense to me how individuals in my community could even speak what they were speaking when it came to discrimination, how they mocked Asian accents, how they treated white people, how they treated their own kind. And it happens in every community. And this is the point that I'm trying to make is we are all the byproduct of the system of white supremacy, and we have to wake up to understand.
And it hurts all of us. This is the thing that
Yes.
I think that it's really critical to understand. Even as white supremacy gives people with my pigment privileges, unearned privileges in society and all across the board, it is also profoundly destructive and harmful spiritually, emotionally, physically, in every way. Christian,
Absolutely.
so like this concept of white supremacy, I want to circle us back to the very concept of justice AI and artificial intelligence and ask you, so the dangers of artificial intelligence being built by corporations that are steeped in that white supremacy and capitalism. Like, make some of those links for both me and viewers and listeners of Redneck Gone Green.
For sure. And it's absolutely valid. All of the businesses that are creating these large language models are not only hyper pumping their data sets with all of the bias, but they're not really taking the additional steps to mitigate bias the right way. And that's by identifying that bias is the stemming of white supremacy and colonial white supremacy. Because if we did that, right, if that became the norm, that we have to understand what's going to happen is that then they would have to admit, everyone would have to admit that the system of white supremacy actually exists. And for the people who actually privilege from that or believe they privilege from that, that is the truth that they don't want to actually come out, right? It's not it's the truth that we pull the curtain on. And so Justice AI is more than just a tool. I honestly believe that it is a movement. People who are looking to deconstruct from themselves. And let me just segue into a little tangent here. My deconstruction as a brown man, an Afro-Latino man, who grew up in a hyper-patriarchal household. The machismo was running rampant in my household. I was conditioned to see women a certain way, treat people a certain way, defend myself a certain way, speak a certain way, and carry a level of discrimination that was just out of this world. And I grew up in a Catholic household. So all of these realities shaped me into who I was at a very young age. And when I started my deconstruction, it was painful. I had to grieve. I had to understand where I was missing the mark. And it leaves you with the choice when you're doing this work. You either have to make the commitment to do better when you learn better, or you stay stagnant and you stay in a position where life is just going to continue to treat you poorly and you are never going to heal yourself. And so, going back to your point with AI, I think it's more important now than ever that we start having these conversations and that understand ultimately that it is for collective liberation. That is why I built Justice AI, so that we
So,
can
Christian,
liberate.
I'm gonna pause you because I want to really interrogate this because I want to understand it.
Yes, sir.
Because again, I looked at AI and I was like, man, this is terrible. It's going to just displace jobs. It's going to be horrific. But reading a little more deeply onto it in techno feudalism, I want to lift up Yanis Varoufakis, whose work has really helped me understand it. Explain to me so I can understand it. How does your framework, Justice AI, attempt to embed issues of justice and ethics and liberation into its design as opposed to the Chat GPT and others that I might be familiar with?
Absolutely. No, it's a very valid and important question. When we talk about the bias in the data set that it's been programmed by, it's all Eurocentric colonial bias. If colonial bias is what causes, if colonialism and white supremacy is what causes the bias, then the antithesis and the remedy is decoloniality. And so we have to understand, and I have had to work with all of the experts in this field to put this data set together in this framework, so that what happens is that when you, let's say you, a white person, or someone else in the audience, starts using Justice AI and you start asking it these questions, what's going to happen is Justice AI uses the data set that's trained on OpenAI, which is the Eurocentric bias data set, and it automatically decolonizes the bias. It identifies where the colonial bias is, and it reframes this entire answer to give you this decolonized full picture. We have to understand something. Decolonization doesn't mean that everything that happened in colonization is wrong. Let's just be honest. But it is not the full picture. Colonization has ultimately stolen ideas and beliefs from cultures all around the world, and decolonization just gives you the full picture of what that actually looks like without the colonial lens. And so it gets a little muddled and a little wonky for people who haven't had this conversation before. Decoloniality is a new term that people are just now learning, decolonization. So you have to understand that the decolonial data set that we've built just gives you the full picture of whatever you're asking the GPT. And I just feel like this is the tool that everybody should be using to ask the questions about race and sexuality and their upbringing and help them deconstruct from their own biases.
So thank you so much for that. Again, like as I am on my own journey, and I'm 63 years old, right, and continuing to learn and trying to better understand the world and my place in it, and I'll own my Marxism. The point is not just to understand the world, but to change it. I want to ask you, Christian, when you lay out this decoloniality lens and trying to use the technology of artificial intelligence and this new thing called Justice AI, I'm hearing you say that artificial intelligence as a technology could actually be a tool for liberation. Am I being simplistic here, or am I hearing you properly?
No, I think you nailed it. And what I always tell people, because I run into this situation all the time. Well, what about the impacts that it's having on the environment? And what about the water usage that it takes and all of these things? All valid concerns, even with AI art, where they're like, it's stealing information. There's a lot of misinformation that's happening within AI. And when it comes to things that we don't really know, what automatically happens is we resort to the fear mongering, and we resort to the fear because we hear these concerns and we don't have the solutions. And it's easier to choose the fear rather than self-educate. But ultimately, what I tell everyone is this: AI actually isn't the problem. Capitalism is, right? And if we really want to focus on deconstructing what the real issues are, then we have to take a deeper look into the system that we have inherited, which is a racial capitalist system, and how it operates and how it uses every single one of us, whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian, or other, neurodivergent, queer, or other. it uses every single one of us. It weaponizes us against each other. So AI is not the issue here. And I've built something that is literally proven time and time again how it can deconstruct these biases and really make life-changing moments for people who are using it on the other side.
Well, Christian, you really you nailed it for me, and I think uh, it's really important to understand the intersection between white supremacy and capitalism, and then have a conversation around artificial intelligence. So, to me, I'm gonna push you to help us understand artificial intelligence is not. You said artificial intelligence is not the problem. Capitalism is the problem. So I want you uh, to, to help us understand how artificial intelligence as a tool could help somebody like me who's trying to create a post-capitalist economy. Again, Christian, here on Redneck Gone Green, we do not shy away from the fact that capitalism is destroying the planet, that it is creating a racist, sexist, class oppressive society with the pillage and plunder of Mother Earth. Like, if we do not interrupt capitalism in its not even late stage anymore, this is end stage. There's no doubt in my mind, techno feudalism is the end of capitalism as we've currently understood it, because it's entering into its last stages as it turns on itself, right? Anybody who has studied how economic systems work, especially under capitalism, there are inherent contradictions here. And they are coming, these chickens are coming home to roost, right? So, what I'm getting at is that this idea of being able to use this technology, because we're not putting this genie back in the bottle, even if we wanted to, right?
No, you can't.
Like, so how do we, in fact, deal with this reality? This is what I'm pushing you to help me to understand, Christian.
Absolutely.
How do we do this?
Yeah, absolutely. It is such a valid question, and it is such a great point that you're making. Ultimately, I'm going to say this in the conversation where AI isn't the problem, capitalism is. We have to understand that capitalism ultimately is all about exploitation of the worker and hoarding of wealth without a framework of redistribution. That's ultimately capitalism. It's about how can I get to the top and screw everybody else, right? This is literally how, in the most simplest terms, this framework operates. And so, yes, ultimately it eats itself alive. I believe that, at least my goal is that I develop the system so that corporations can adopt it, right? I think that when organizations adopt an ethical AI tool like this, where the goal is to conduct bias audits within policies and procedures, documentation, HR, ethnic training, or right, like what do they call it? Cultural competency training. Then what you're doing from an organizational standpoint, if organizations today run the world, then I think we start there. When organizations adopt tools like this, they start having the proper training, the proper conversations. They eradicate their egos and take a moment to take a step back and understand that this system actually isn't helping any of their workers. And what does real leadership look like? I believe that it is a responsibility that people in positions of power ultimately use tools like this so that they can learn how to build inclusive cultures within their organizations. And imagine the impact that that would have as a trickle down effect when it goes from CEO down to customer service call center agents or customer service agents on the floor who feel heard and seen, and now they feel respected. They feel like we're making some type of progress. That export that company is going to then have through its agents is going to change everything in how they I'm a marketing person, so I think about all of this, right? Like, from the content you put out from your organization to the customer service that you deliver, everything looks completely different when you start rearranging the internal structures of your organization. Now, to your earlier point, as a white person specifically using this tool, you can ask questions about, like, how does the system of white supremacy actually impact me? there, you know, I can go down a series of rabbit holes with this. But I'll give you an example of a friend of mine who used Justice AI recently, and it was just life changing for him. And it was probably an interaction that he had with the GPT for about maybe 10 to 20 minutes. And he asked a series of questions. He told the GPT about his identity. Come to find out, he was about a 50-year-old white man at the time living in the South who was closeted, and he was queer, and he couldn't come out because the patriarchy, which is one of the arms of white supremacy, told him that he would be excluded. The family would kick him out if he was ever gay. The church would ban him. He ended up being married and had 3 kids and is living as a closeted gay man today, and had no idea that that was all part of the system of white supremacy and patriarchy. And so we are using these tools today to help connect and piece the puzzles of our own experiences, because what happens is when you get to understand yourself, you are able to live more freely and make decisions, and it could help you navigate how to handle all of these situations within your reality. It has been completely life-changing, not only for my users, but for me to watch these things as well. And I hope that answered your question. I feel like I went all over the place with that, but
well, it's a multifaceted question, and you gave a deep and complex answer. And this will give me the opportunity to tell viewers and or listeners that you listening and or watching Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. We're speaking to Christian Ortiz. Christian is a filmmaker, a musician, a photographer, an artist, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a decolonial technologist. He's created the first artificial intelligence that specifically comes from a decolonial lens. And we're talking about Justice AI and the impacts there. So, Christian, I'm going to circle back now and ask you a question. How do you talk to a working class white person or a poor white person who says, looky here, I'm not privileged, I'm struggling, and I've been struggling since I was born? How do you help such a person as that understand white supremacy as actually harmful to that person as well? How do we bridge some of those divides?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I have a lot of those conversations. I live on social media because I post a lot, and I hate the term bootstrap, but I have to bootstrap everything that I do. There's not really a budget for decolonization. When I have a lot of these conversations, what I ultimately realize, I have to enter these conversations not pointing the finger. And I also have to pick and choose my battles. I can't really interject on someone's discriminatory comments, or if I hear them out in public, then I have an opportunity to either inject myself into the conversation, try not to be nosy, but really just trying to educate someone. And then I have to really understand and meet them where they are in terms of their understanding, their conditioning. There's this implicit conditioning that we all have to see the world based off of our lived experiences. And I have to understand and communicate to them that I understand why they see their identity as it is, and help them understand that it is also just it is imaginary. It was something that was constructed for them, and it's a very complicated conversation to have. Ultimately, I just have to pick my battles. I have to remember that I can't convince anybody about anything that they don't want to understand in the moment. And this really becomes a journey for the individual who's ready to listen. And a lot of people aren't ready.
I got to say, I really appreciate you saying that, because, I'll be really transparent here, Christian. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about how to frame something in a way that will be the most persuasive and the most illuminating. And, I still want to be persuasive to the extent that I can, but I've also changed, and because I realized something my mama used to say, and that is, you can't wake somebody up who's only pretending to be asleep, right? And so, these days I try to lean more into principled struggle, where we say, I really want to ask enough questions so I can really understand where you're coming from and what you about and what your worldview is and what you're trying to do. And I hopefully try to explain to you who I am and what I'm about and what I'm trying to do. And that way we can figure out how we can work together and how we can't.
Mm.
And, I've never found anybody I agree with 100%. Christian, I don't agree with myself 100% of the time, right? But what I'm saying is, once I figure out where you really are and who you are, what you're about, then we can relate to each other.
Yeah.
And I like to say, if at the end of a conversation I'm like, well, I agree with about 90% of what Christian says, then I try to make it a point to say, when I talk to Christian next time, I'm gonna spend 90% of my time talking about what we could do together, how we can collaborate, and
Yeah.
only 10% of the time arguing and fussing about where our disagreements are. Because one of the things that I've been really disappointed in the left is a level of divisiveness, and it feels like less about trying to understand, illuminate, and figure out how to move forward, and more about proving who's right or smarter.
100%. This is why I stay truly apolitical. I don't take sides. I worked in so many political campaigns for the left for years, especially during COVID. And to your point, that is exactly what I ran into. And ultimately, I understood. I got to see the big picture. Not only were individuals doing this, they were getting into politics and saying all the things for clout, and because they weren't being legitimate, about their causes. They were doing it because it was the right thing to say to get the votes. And what I also understand is that no matter how good your intentions are going into politics, you're still serving the empire, right? And so we my I was left with a position to understand that we have to collectively figure out a way to build something new. It doesn't mean taking away the afterbirth of colonization, for lack of a better phrase, but it's using what we know today and using and learning how societies operated before colonization to merge these ideas and build something completely new that none of us have seen, but that make the most sense for collective liberation.
Christian, I'm loving this conversation. I want to do a little thought experiment with you right here in front of the goddess and everybody.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you to think about one or two books that you would think, all right, I see who David Cobb is, and the kind of audience he attracts. What's one or two books that you're like, man, you know what? I really wish, because not everybody's a reader, but for those who are readers, one or two books that you're like, man, it would really help if folks were to read blank.
That's a really, really good question. Here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to give out a couple of titles, but I want you to remember that when these books were written, they were pretty limited in the understanding of how we understood the system of white supremacy collectively. I always say you can't be anti-racist if you're also anti-LGBTQ, or if white supremacy comes in so many forms or fashions. You can't be a misogynist and be anti-black. Like, it just doesn't really work, because white supremacy comes in many different forms or fashions. And I say that because a lot of the books that you're going to read are revolutionary, but they also leave out a lot of the things that we need to examine, like patriarchy and misogyny and misogynoir and all of these concepts that we just really don't think about. And so, okay, so I'm going to say Decolonial Theories in Comparison. I think that's the name of the book. Decolonial Theories in Comparison by Breny Mendoza, Breny Mendoza. They offer a critical comparative analysis of Latin American decoloniality versus settler colonial theories. It's a really good one. Decolonial Theories in Comparison by Breny Mendoza. I would say also, I have a book, not to promote my own book because I hate self-promoting, but I wrote about this. It's called The Decolonial Awakening. You can find it on Amazon. You can also get it on Kindle or the digital version. Um, I think that's just a good starting point right there.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask another question, and that is, as somebody who is in fact a technologist doing this kind of work, what's a myth about artificial intelligence that you want to bust?
Ooh. Uh, I believe that artificial intelligence could be used for collective liberation across the foundation of society.
Now, that's a provocative and challenging response. I'm glad I asked you. I got a couple more for you.
Of course.
What is one thing that people with my pigment, white folks, can do to help reject whiteness as a system of power?
That's a great question. I would encourage all of our white brothers and sisters, you included, my friend, to really take a deep dive as slowly as you possibly can into decolonization, understanding how this works, and Googling titles on how colonization has affected white people. It's all out there. I mean, all of this stuff is out there. And I think it really is about trying to find as many videos on YouTube that you can find, books that you can find, and finding the authors that resonate with you the most. I'm neurodivergent. Reading is pretty difficult for me simply because of my brain, ADHD, and dyslexia. But when I find an author that I truly love and that resonates with me, it makes it so much of an easier task to take on, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the challenge and turning it back on me in a very kind and compassionate way.
It's all love.
No, yeah, no, I felt it that way. Like where I'm from, we got a saying, Christian. Even a dog knows the difference between a kick, a trip, and a pet. Right? They all physical contact, but there's different intentions behind it.
I love that. I'm going to use that.
And so here's another one for you. And I want you to be as concrete as you can be, because I already know that you believe the answer is yes. So
Okay.
what role can artificial intelligence play in a liberated future?
Oof. I think that's a great question. I think ultimately, in order to answer that honestly, we have to really have the confidence in humanity and in each other to believe that the people who are behind the wheel, who are developing these AIs, understand the importance of training the data, right? If it's all about data and if it's all about biased data sets, I'm going to encourage your audience and you, if you haven't heard, to check out Joy Buolamwini. She's on LinkedIn. She's a phenomenal author, and she's the author of Unmasking AI. And she was one of the pioneers of decolonizing AI when she discovered that the facial recognition softwares were not trained on dark pigments, but white people. And so when we talk about bias, it's more than just language models. It's how are we training facial recognition scanners, hand syncs to recognize, sometimes the syncs don't come out if you put your hands topped like this and you're a brown person. But if you flip your hands out and it reads the white pigment, that means it'll turn on for you. Same thing for certain AI programmed into dispensers of paper towels. So to answer that question, I have to give my confidence to society to say, let's start having these conversations more and trust that the developers will absolutely dedicate themselves on building diverse data sets so that these tools can truly make real world change, whether it's HR, hand syncs, language models, and beyond.
Christian, you remind me of one of my favorite quotes about love and revolution. I reckon you know it, but I'm going to say it out loud. Che Guevara famously said, and I quote, "At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love." And when I hear you talk like this, it just resonates for me. Christian, the hour has just flown by, so I'm going to give you a chance for final thoughts, including where people can learn more about your work, support your work, and get involved.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. I am very easy to find. My name is, of course, Christian Ortiz. I go by Zacateco on a lot of platforms. It's just a name that was given to me in community. That's ZACA Tech, TECH, and an O for my Zacatecan history and my technology field. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm on TikTok. I talk about this everywhere. I'm on Substack. And I just encourage you to sign up to my newsletters. You don't ever have to give any financial compensation for me. The payment is how many minds can I decolonize in the next 30 years? And I just invite you to community. I invite you to conversations. I invite you to really challenge not only me, but challenge yourself and really take a step back to remember and understand that you were conditioned to see the world the way that you do. And there is a possibility and this freeing liberation to unlearn everything you've unlearned and learn to see the world in a way that you never thought possible.
Christian, what a lovely way to conclude this conversation. I want to thank you so much for coming on to this program. I will confess, y'all, Christian's essay just popped up in my social media. I reached out to him, and the fella wrote me right back. And now we're engaged on LinkedIn, and I've been following his stuff. It's good stuff. So thank you, Christian Ortiz, for joining us here on Redneck Gone Green. I'm going to ask folks to please like, comment, subscribe. Remember that this is really a community, y'all, that we're building together. It is growing, getting larger, stronger, and more powerful every day. And it's something that the ruling elite and the predatory class just cannot abide. And that is when people who look like me start to talk with people who look like Christian, and we find the common humanity. So we can continue to grow. We're going to continue to grow. I want to also invite you to take a look at the Worker Co-op Academy that my dear friend and comrade Emily Kawano and I are offering in conjunction with our friends at Democracy at Work. Check that out. And lastly, I want to encourage you to join us every week, Monday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Next Monday, the esteemed Professor Rick Wolf will join us, and we're going to be doing a deep dive conversation on what is happening and what is to be done. In the meantime, I want to say thank you again for joining this community. Thanks for what you do. Keep on keeping on. Peace.